In the autumn of 1818, a glass of fresh milk killed the mother of a future president of the United States. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, a quiet, capable woman who had kept her family alive through the raw Indiana wilderness, drank from the family cow and was dead within a week. Her son Abraham was 9 years old. He watched her go. The neighbors called it milk sickness. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know it would come back for their families too. What they knew was that good land, fertile, promising land along the Wabash and Ohio rivers, had to be abandoned. People packed up everything they owned and ran from their farms the way you run from a fire, because something in the pasture was killing them, and no one knew what. That is not the Wild West you grew up watching. The version most of us got, the one with clean saloons and heroic trail riders and cowboy wisdom passed down like gospel, had most of the danger edited out. Not the gunfight danger, the quiet kind, the kind that came in through what you ate. Every man, woman, and child who crossed into the American frontier faced a food supply that could end them without warning. The water could do it, the plants could do it, the whiskey behind the bar almost certainly would. The hardest part wasn't getting to the frontier. It was surviving long enough to eat breakfast. There was a wildflower so common along the shaded edges of Midwestern forests that no one looked twice at it, and yet its toxin moved through cow's milk so silently that the animal showed no signs at all. A woman in southeastern Illinois spent years tracking down the killer, and the medical establishment ignored her for nearly a century because she was a midwife, not a doctor. Out on the Oregon Trail, children were dying of violent seizures within 15 minutes of picking the wrong root from the creek bank. The plant that killed them looked identical to something edible, and the indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest had developed a precise multi-day process to tell them apart, a process that the immigrants arriving by the tens of thousands never learned. And the whiskey. The frontier saloon whiskey was not aged bourbon. It was industrial grain alcohol that cost 20 cents a gallon in St. Louis, watered down by half, and then, because diluting it removed the color, the burn, and the bite, laced with strychnine to put the kick back in. This is what the frontier actually tasted like. The wildflower that killed Nancy Hanks Lincoln was white snakeroot, Ageratina altissima, a delicate, shade-loving plant with small, fuzzy white clusters of blooms that grow along the margins of forests throughout the Ohio River Valley. It doesn't look dangerous. It looks like something you'd press between the pages of a journal. But inside its leaves and stems lives a compound called trematol, and trematol is one of the more elegant biological traps in North American nature. When free-ranging cattle grazed on snakeroot during the dry late summer months, when the good pasture grass had died and shade plants were all that remained, they metabolized trematol directly into their milk. The cow felt nothing. She went on producing. The nursing calf began to tremble and collapse within days. The family that drank her milk on a Tuesday was burying someone by the weekend. The mortality rate for milk sickness exceeded 50%. Entire communities dissolved. Farms were left mid-season. The disease moved invisibly through dairy and through beef, and doctors in eastern cities offered theories. Bad swamp air, cobalt in the soil, some unnamed bacteria, because they refused to consider that the answer had already been found. A midwife named Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby, who had trained in Philadelphia and settled in Hardin County, Illinois, lost her mother and her sister-in-law to milk sickness. Grief, for a woman like Anna Bixby, produced something sharper than sadness. She began testing. She fed plant samples to calves and recorded what happened. And then, sometime in the 1830s, an elderly Shawnee medicine woman, known to the settlers only as Aunt Shawnee, walked her to the edge of a tree line and showed her the plant. The Shawnee had known what white snakeroot did for generations. They shared the knowledge freely. Bixby spent the next years convincing local farmers to clear the plant from their pasture edges, and the outbreaks diminished. The academic journals ignored her entirely. The United States Department of Agriculture didn't formally verify her findings until 1927, nearly a century after a Shawnee woman stood in an Illinois forest and pointed at the answer. That knowledge, and the woman who carried it, were not erased by accident. They were erased by a system that decided who got to be right before the evidence came in. Further west, emigrants arriving in the high mountain meadows of the Rockies in the Pacific Northwest encountered a plant the Nez Perce and Shoshone nations had been harvesting carefully for generations. The blue camas, Camassia quamash, a flowering bulb with a rich, sweet flavor that could sustain a family through winter. When the flowers bloomed in spring, brilliant purple-blue against the green meadow, the camas fields were among the most important food sources in the entire region, and growing among them, in almost the same soil, with an almost identical underground bulb, was meadow death camas, Zygodanus venenosus. Its flowers were a pale yellowish white. When you knew what to look for, you could tell them apart. In the spring, when both were in bloom, the difference was visible. Indigenous women had developed the practice of weeding camas fields in the spring precisely because of this, pulling the white-flowered death camas before the flowers fell, so that when the autumn harvest came and both plants had gone to seed and looked identical underground, the fields were safe. That was the system. It required knowledge, and it required work done months in advance. White emigrants crossing the trail in the fall had neither. They dug camas bulbs by the basket and ate them raw, and some of them died within the hour. Death camas contain zygosine, a steroidal alkaloid that prevents cellular sodium channels from closing, causing neurotoxicity, a plummeting heart rate, convulsions, and cardiac arrest. 15 minutes from ingestion to death was not unusual. In September of 1805, even the Lewis and Clark expedition, men with military training and a mission they were desperate to complete, were felled by this landscape's food. The Nez Perce gave them blue camas roots, but the corpse ate them undercooked. The blue camas bulb is packed with inulin, a complex carbohydrate the human gut cannot process without extensive preparation. Traditional processing required baking the bulbs in earth pits for 24 to 48 hours to convert the inulin into digestible fructose. The entire Corps of Discovery spent days too sick to walk, unable to build canoes, unable to travel, brought down not by war or weather, but by an improperly cooked vegetable. The knowledge was available. The Nez Perce held it in full. The Corps didn't ask the right questions, and their journals record the consequence in painful, specific detail. In St. Louis in the 1870s, a saloon owner could purchase industrial-grade neutral grain alcohol for approximately 20 cents a gallon. By the time that same spirit reached a frontier mining camp or a trail outpost and was poured across a bar, it sold for up to $5 a pint. That is a profit margin, when you run the math, of over 24,000%. The men doing that math were not going to leave money on the table by using actual aged whiskey. The challenge was cosmetic. Watering down the base spirit removed the color, the body, and the burn. So frontier traders replaced them, chemically. Chewing tobacco gave the liquid an amber color and a faint nausea associated in the drinker's mind with strength. A plug of tobacco dissolved in a barrel of diluted spirit. Soap or castor oil, agitated into the mixture, produced a surface bead, the ring of tiny bubbles that experienced drinkers recognized as proof of high-proof whiskey. Sulfuric acid, which they sometimes called vitriol, restored the burning throat sensation, and strychnine, the same compound used to kill rats, was added because it produced a genuine physiological rush, a stimulant jolt that mimicked the feeling of real bourbon hitting the bloodstream. A man who drank 3 glasses of this in an evening was not getting drunk. He was being slowly poisoned by a cocktail of tobacco alkaloids, soap compounds, corrosive acid, and a convulsant. The saloon itself compounded the danger in ways that had nothing to do with what was in the glass. Bartenders kept a single bucket of water behind the bar to rinse glasses between customers. A communal towel hung from the front rail, used by every patron in the place to wipe their face and hands. In a crowded mining camp in a space with low ceilings and no ventilation, that towel was a vector for tuberculosis and influenza, moving from man to man all night long. You could walk into a frontier saloon perfectly healthy and leave carrying something that would kill you over the following winter. The deception that happened at the frontier bar was improvised, opportunistic, local. What happened when the United States government got involved in feeding its own soldiers was something more organized and in some ways more disturbing. In 1898, as American troops shipped out for Cuba during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. War Department contracted with the three largest meat packing companies in Chicago, Armour & Company, Swift & Company, and Morris & Company, to supply canned and refrigerated beef for the troops. What arrived at the military staging camps was something that turned the stomachs of men who had already seen combat. General Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the United States Army, testified that the meat smelled, in his direct words, similar to a dead human body after being injected with formaldehyde, because that is, in substance, what it was. The beef had been treated with boric acid and a preservative compound called freezine, a mixture built around sulfur and formaldehyde, to mask the smell and texture of meat that had already begun to decompose. Soldiers who ate it suffered violent outbreaks of dysentery and food poisoning throughout the campaign. Theodore Roosevelt, who had ridden with the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, stated in testimony that he would sooner have eaten his hat. The frontier was hard because the land was hard and the systems were corrupt and the knowledge was unevenly distributed. But the people who survived it were not lucky. They were paying attention. Tell me in the comments, did anyone in your family pass down the kind of knowledge we talked about today? I want to know what survived.